The cottonwood tree came down in the night, splitting clean at the root and crashing across the only road that connected Harlan's crossing to the rest of the New Mexico territory. And by the time the sun rose gold and indifferent over the mesa, Rebecca Quinn was already out there in the dust with her bare hands wrapped around a broken branch, pulling with everything she had left in her body. That was the thing about Rebecca Quinn. She had never been the kind of woman who stood at a window waiting for someone else to fix what needed fixing. Not when she was a girl growing up in the hardscrabble farmlands outside of Santa Fe. Not when she married Thomas Quinn at 22 and built a life with him out of red dirt and sheer determination. And certainly not now, at 28, when Thomas had been in the ground for 14 months and the world kept right on spinning without offering her so much as a moment to catch her breath. She was 30 yards from her front porch when she spotted the tree. It was enormous, the kind of cottonwood that had been standing since before any white settler had ever laid eyes on this particular bend in the road. The trunk was nearly 4 feet across at the base, and it had fallen so completely, so thoroughly, that it had taken a good 10 yards of fence line with it and completely blocked the road from one side to the other. Rebecca stood there in the early morning light, her brown hair loose and tangled from sleep, still pulling on her work boots as she walked, and she looked at that tree for a long time. She turned around and looked at her house, a modest 2-room adobe sitting quiet and still in the dawn haze. She looked back at the tree. She thought about her neighbor, old Cora Pembroke, who lived 3 miles down that road and who had been nursing a bad lung since February and needed Rebecca to bring her medicine from town today. There was no going around the fallen tree. The ravine on one side was too steep, and the scrub brush on the other was so thick with thorns it would tear a horse to ribbons. Rebecca pulled her boot the rest of the way on, straightened up, and walked toward the tree. She started with the smaller branches, the ones that had shattered when the trunk hit the ground. She dragged them off the road by the armful, tossing them into the scrub on the far side. The morning was already warm, the way New Mexico mornings tended to be even in early April of 1878, and within a few minutes she had sweat darkening the back of her worn cotton blouse. She worked methodically, without hurrying, without slowing down, moving in that particular rhythm she had developed over years of doing hard things alone. The branches took her the better part of an hour. When she got to the main trunk, she stood back and studied it with the same practical eye Thomas had always said made her better at farming than most men he knew. The trunk was too thick to move by dragging. She would need a different approach. She went back to the house and came out with a long-handled axe that had belonged to Thomas, its head freshly sharpened, because she kept everything sharpened and oiled, and in good working order because that was what you did when there was no one else to do it. She also brought the heavy rope she used for hauling, winding it over her shoulder as she walked back to the road. Her plan was to chop the trunk in 2 places, creating a section short enough to roll to the side of the road using the rope and what leverage she could manage. It was not an elegant plan. It was not a quick plan. But it was a plan that would work, which was the only kind of plan Rebecca Quinn ever bothered making. She set her feet, lifted the axe, and went to work. The sound of the axe rang out clean and sharp across the flatland, carrying in the still morning air the way sounds do in the desert, traveling much farther than they seem like they should. She was a strong woman, genuinely strong from years of physical labor, and she swung with good form, driving the blade deep into the wood with each stroke, and then twisting it free and swinging again. Chips of pale wood flew and scattered in the dust at her feet. She had worked herself about halfway through the trunk on the first cut when she heard the sound of hooves coming up the road from the direction of Harlan's crossing. She did not stop swinging. She was in the middle of something, and stopping in the middle of something was not her way. The rider slowed when he saw her, and she heard the horse blow out a soft sound that horses make when they are surprised but not frightened. She finished her swing, pulled the axe free, and straightened up, turning to look at who had come. He was a tall man on a tall horse, a roan with white stockings that was breathing hard in a way that said he had been ridden at some speed for some distance. The man himself had the look of someone who had been traveling since before first light. His hat was a wide-brimmed brown felt that had seen considerable weather, and his coat was the kind of long canvas duster that serious working cowboys wore, the kind that shed rain and wind with equal indifference. He had dark hair that curled slightly where it touched the back of his neck, and his jaw was dusted with a few days of dark stubble. He was not young and not old, somewhere in his early 30s, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had spent a great deal of time squinting into the sun and thinking hard about whatever it was looking at. He pulled the horse up a few yards from her and looked at the tree, at the branches already cleared and piled neatly at the side of the road, at the rope coiled over her shoulder, at the axe in her hands, at the deep cut she had already made into the trunk, and then he looked at her. She looked back at him, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I am sorry I am late," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, and the words came out carrying something in them that was more than a polite phrase, something that sounded almost like he meant it personally, like he had somewhere specific been expected and had failed to arrive on time. Rebecca blinked at him. "I do not know who you are," she said, "so I do not know how you could be late." He swung down from the horse in a single fluid motion, landing in the dust and reaching up to secure the reins around a standing bit of fence post. "Milton Hale," he said, and he held out his hand. "I ride out of the Delaney spread, 7 miles east. Saw the tree go down last night in that wind. Meant to come at first light, but my horse threw a shoe and it took me time I did not have." She looked at his hand for a moment. It was a working man's hand, calloused and strong, with a thin white scar running across the knuckles of the first 2 fingers. She shook it. "Rebecca Quinn," she said, "this is my land." "I know it," he said. He looked at the tree again, assessing it the same way she had. "You have made a good start." "I would have had it done by now without the shoe trouble," she said, and she meant it matter-of-factly, not as a reproach to him, because she was not in the habit of reproaching people for things that were not their fault. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "I expect you would have," he said. She handed him the axe without being asked, because she could see that he understood what needed doing and that his arms were longer, and he would be able to drive deeper with each stroke. It was simply the most efficient arrangement. She held the rope and waited, and he set his feet exactly where she had been standing and went to work. And there was a moment, just one, where she noticed the way his shoulders moved under that duster coat, the fluid-controlled power of it, and she looked away very quickly toward the distant mesa and told herself firmly to keep her mind on the task at hand. They worked together with very little talking, which suited them both. He finished her first cut, then moved to where she indicated for the second one, and she watched him work and thought that he swung an axe the way a person swings an axe when they have been doing it since they were old enough to hold one. When the second cut was through, she took one end of the rope and he took the other, and with a count of 3 they hauled the severed section clear of the road, straining hard against the weight until the thing rolled into the ditch with a heavy thud that sent dust billowing up around their boots. They stood back and looked at the road, now clear enough for a wagon to pass through. Rebecca coiled the rope back over her shoulder and reached for the axe, which he held out to her handle first with a natural ease that meant he had thought about it, that he had known she would want her own things back in her own hands. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not waiting on me," he said, and there was that almost smile again. "Cora Pembroke is going to need that medicine before noon." She looked at him sharply. "You know about Cora. She is the only one who lives down this road," he said simply, "and everyone in the county knows she has been sick." Rebecca studied him for a moment. He had an honest face, she decided. Not a soft face, not an easy face, but honest. The kind of face that did not work to appear trustworthy because it had not occurred to it to appear as anything other than what it was. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked. He looked surprised. Not dramatically surprised, just a flicker of it, quickly controlled. "I have not. Come up to the house," she said. "It is the least I can do." She did not wait to see if he would follow. She simply started walking toward the house, and after a moment she heard his boots and then the soft clop of the roan's hooves as he led the horse along behind her. She had kept the house the same since Thomas died, meaning she had kept it clean and functional and entirely without sentimentality. The kitchen was small but well organized, with copper pots hanging from a beam overhead and a good iron stove that she had learned to coax into perfect temperature in any weather. She had made biscuits that morning before she had gone out to see about the tree, and they were still warm in the cloth she had wrapped them in, and there were eggs and a bit of salt pork that she put on quickly, working with an economy of motion that meant everything was on the table in less than 10 minutes. Milton Hale sat where she indicated, at the near end of the small table, and he took his hat off and set it beside his chair, which she noticed because not all men remembered to do that, and he thanked her quietly when she put the plate in front of him, and he ate with the kind of careful attention that meant he was genuinely hungry but had been taught manners well enough that he was not going to let the hunger embarrass him. "You work for Delaney?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own coffee. "Going on 4 years," he said, "foreman now for the past year and a half. I know of the Delaney spread," she said. "They run a clean operation." "They do," he agreed. "Where are you from originally?" He looked up from his plate. He had gray eyes she saw now in the better light of the kitchen, a clear and steady gray that reminded her of the sky just before a rain when the light was still good. "Texas," he said, "southeast of San Antonio. My family had a place there until the drought of '68 took it." "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it because she knew what it was to lose something you had built. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I was 18. I went to work driving cattle, and I have mostly been going north ever since. And you ended up in New Mexico territory." "I did," he said. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same direct attention he gave everything. "You are from here?" "Santa Fe originally," she said. "My husband Thomas was from Kansas. He came out here in '69 and I met him 2 years later. We built this place together." She said it plainly, without grief in her voice, but also without pretending the grief was not somewhere underneath the plainness. "He passed," Milton said. It was not a question, said gently, without prying. 14 months ago," she said. "Horse rolled on him. It was quick." Milton nodded slowly. "I heard of a Thomas Quinn," he said. "Before I knew it was this place, people spoke well of him." "They were right to," she said. She picked up her coffee cup. "He was a good man." There was a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that is not uncomfortable at all but is instead simply a natural pause between two people who are both thinking about something real. Then Milton said, "Are you managing this place alone?" "I am," she said, and her chin came up just slightly, not in defiance, just in statement of fact. He nodded, as if she had answered a question he had needed answered for some practical reason rather than a prying one. "The fence line that came down with the tree," he said. "It is going to need new posts on that eastern section." "I know it," she said. "I have posts in the barn. I can help you set them before I head on," he said, "if you will have the help." She considered him for a moment. Outside, the morning light was brightening, pouring in clean and golden through the small east-facing window and laying a warm rectangle across the table between them. "I will have the help," she said. They set the fence posts that morning, working with a quiet companionship that felt strangely like something very old. He dug while she mixed the quick lime, and they set each post together with the focused shared attention of people who understood what they were doing and did not need to explain it to each other at every step. The roan grazed on the dry spring grass beside the road, switching his tail peacefully, and a pair of meadowlarks argued cheerfully in the scrub, and the sun climbed higher and warmer, and Rebecca was aware, as she had not been aware of anything in a very long time, of another person in her proximity, the sound of his breathing when they lifted together, the brief warmth of his arm near hers when they were both pressing a post into place. She did not know what to do with that awareness. She filed it away in the same place. She filed most things that she did not immediately know what to do with which was a place somewhere behind her sternum that she generally kept very well organized and very tightly shut. When the last post was in, he straightened up and pushed his hat back on his head and looked at their work with a satisfied expression that she recognized because she wore the same expression herself when something was done right. "That will hold," he said. "It will," she agreed. He collected his tools and went to his horse. He was already in the saddle and she was already thinking about getting the medicine to Cora when he said, "Mrs. Quinn." She turned. "I come by this road once a week usually," he said, "taking supplies to the Delaney far pasture." He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say but is being very careful about how he says it, keeping his voice level and his expression measured. "If you ever need anything." She looked up at him on his horse, the morning light full on both of them now, and she said, "I manage fine." "I know you do," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not condescension and not pity and not any of the things she was braced against, but was something quieter and more careful than that, something that sounded almost like it was saying that he simply did not want to stop knowing she was here. "Good day, Mrs. Quinn." "Good day, Mr. Hale," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and rode south, and she watched the roan's white-stockinged hooves carry him away until the dust settled back onto the road, and she could not see him any more. Then she went to harness her own horse and get Cora Pembroke her medicine. She thought about him on the ride to Cora's. She thought about the way he had said he was sorry he was late, as if he had known he was supposed to be there, as if the obligation had been real to him before he even knew her name. She thought about his gray eyes in the light of her kitchen. She thought about the way he had handed her axe back to her handle first. She stopped thinking about him when she got to Cora's because Cora needed her full attention, and giving things her full attention was something Rebecca Quinn took seriously. Cora Pembroke was 63 years old, sharp-tongued and sharp-minded, who had come to New Mexico territory with her husband Frank in 1851, and had outlived him and 2 of her 4 children and every single expectation anyone had ever had of her. She was sitting up in bed when Rebecca arrived, already annoyed about being sick, which Rebecca took as a good sign. "Took you long enough," Cora said. "There was a tree in the road," Rebecca said, setting the medicine on the bedside table. Cora's eyes narrowed. "What kind of tree?" "A large cottonwood." "How did you get past it?" "I moved it." Cora stared at her. "By yourself?" "Mostly," Rebecca said. And then she told Cora about Milton Hale, because Cora was the closest thing she had to a friend, and Cora would find out anyway, because Cora had a network of information that functioned better than any telegraph line in the territory. Cora's expression when Rebecca described him was something Rebecca would think about later, a particular knowing look that Cora wore very well, the look of someone who has seen something coming from a great distance and has been waiting patiently for everyone else to notice it. "Milton Hale," Cora said. "I know of him. Good man. Honest as daylight." "He helped with the fence posts," Rebecca said. "Did he?" Cora said, and her tone implied a great deal more than those 2 words should have been able to carry. "Do not," Rebecca said firmly. "I have not said a single thing," Cora said, with a smile that said everything. Rebecca rode home alone in the afternoon warmth, and she told herself with great firmness that she was a widow with a ranch to run and enough on her hands already, and that she was not the kind of woman who was susceptible to a pair of steady gray eyes and strong shoulders, and a man who apologized for being late to a place he had never been invited. She almost believed herself. The following Wednesday, she was in the east pasture mending a different section of fence when she heard the horse on the road and looked up and saw the roan with the white stockings, moving at a steady, unhurried walk. Milton Hale raised a hand to her from the road, and she raised a hand back, and he kept riding, and that was all. But she was aware of him for the rest of the afternoon in a way that did not leave her until after supper, and she lay awake that night longer than usual, listening to the coyotes in the far distance, thinking about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her because she was ordinarily a very efficient sleeper. The following Wednesday she was closer to the road, and when he raised his hand she straightened up and walked to the fence. "Mr. Hale," she said. He pulled the roan up. "Mrs. Quinn," he looked at the section of fence she was working on. "Barbed wire. It is what keeps the cattle in," she said. He nodded. Then with that careful measured quality, "I have a good pair of wire stretchers if you need them." "I have wire stretchers," she said. "I know you do," he said, and there was the almost smile. She found herself almost smiling back. It was a strange feeling, that warmth coming up in her face, almost as though her face remembered how to do something it had not done in a while. "How is the Delaney Far pasture?" she asked. "Dry," he said, "but the cattle are managing. Delaney is talking about drilling a new well." "That is sensible," she said. "The spring on the East Mesa is getting low." "You have noticed that too," he said. "I notice everything about the water on this land," she said. "When you live on dry land alone you learn to watch the water." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she had the feeling, not for the first time, that he was really looking at her, seeing things people generally glossed over when they looked at a woman running a ranch by herself, either because they expected her to be tragic or because they expected her to be impressive, and neither of those was quite right, and somehow he seemed to understand that neither of those was quite right. "There is a social at the church in Harlan's Crossing this Saturday," he said. "The Reverend Marsh is organizing it, raising money for the new schoolhouse." She waited. "I was wondering," he said, and for the first time she heard something uncertain in his voice, something underneath the steadiness, like a hinge that was being tested for the first time, "if you might be planning to attend." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was golden and the roan shifted its weight with a quiet clop of hoof on hard ground, and somewhere in the cottonwoods by the dry creek a dove was calling. "I had not decided," she said. "I will be there," he said. Not pressuring, not persuading, just offering the information, laying it out plainly the way he seemed to lay everything out, and leaving it to her to do with as she pleased. She thought about Cora Pembroke's knowing look. She thought about being alone in her house on Saturday evenings, the particular quality of that aloneness that she had come to know very well, which was sometimes perfectly fine and sometimes, especially in spring when the evening smelled of dust and new growth and something almost like hope, was a very heavy thing. "Perhaps I will see you there," she said. He touched his hat brim. "I would be glad of it," he said, and rode on. She went to the social. She wore the better of her two good dresses, a dark blue cotton with small white buttons at the wrist, and she put her hair up properly, and she drove herself to town in the wagon with her head very straight and her expression composed, and her hands only the smallest bit tight on the reins. The church social was what a church social in a small town in New Mexico Territory in 1878 was. Crowded and noisy and smelling of sawdust and baked goods, and the particular combination of people who had put on their best for the occasion. Tables outside were loaded with food people had brought, and a man with a fiddle and a man with a jaw harp were playing something fast and cheerful in the corner of the churchyard, and children were running around in the lengthening evening light, and people were talking with the concentrated social energy of people who did not see each other in large groups very often. She had barely tied her horse to the post before she heard Rebecca Quinn, and turned to find Milton Hale making his way through the crowd toward her. He had cleaned up, his dark hair combed back from his face, wearing a good white shirt with the collar buttoned and dark trousers and his hat in his hand, and he was, she could not help noticing, a very good-looking man when he was not covered in trail dust. "You came," he said. "I said perhaps," she said. "You did," he said, and that was somehow both an acknowledgment and a small expression of happiness about how the perhaps had resolved. They walked through the social together, and it was not awkward in the way that it might have been, because Milton Hale had the rare quality of being able to be next to a person without making demands of them, without filling every silence with words or generating social anxiety with his expectations. He introduced her to the Delaney family, who were large and loud and immediately welcoming, and she liked them at once. Old Jim Delaney shook her hand with a firmness that expressed respect, and his wife Clara pressed food on them, both in the way of women who express love primarily through the volume of food they press on others. "We have heard about you," Clara Delaney said warmly, looking between Rebecca and Milton with the same knowing look that Cora Pembroke had deployed, which seemed to be something that certain perceptive women of the territory had developed independently. "Tom Quinn's widow. Everyone says you run that place like nobody's business." "I try to," Rebecca said. "She does more than try," Milton said quietly, and it was said without showiness, just as a simple correction, and Rebecca felt that warmth in her face again and looked toward the fiddle player with great interest. They ate together, sitting on the low fence near the churchyard with plates on their knees, and they talked. Not about difficult things, not that evening, just the ordinary necessary things of people who are beginning to know each other, the shape of each other's days, the small observations and opinions and preferences that build up gradually into something like a picture of a person. She learned that he read, that he kept a small collection of books in his bunkhouse at the Delaney spread, Cooper and Twain, and a battered copy of something, by a man named Emerson that he had found at a trading post and had been working through for 2 years. She learned that he had a brother back in Texas who he wrote to twice a year. She learned that he had once, before the 4 years at Delaney's, been gone for 8 months driving cattle up the Kisham Trail, and that he had decided after that particular long, dusty, miserable, profitable journey that he was done with driving and ready to stay in one place, that there was something in him that wanted to stop moving and simply belong somewhere. That last piece she heard carefully and quietly, and she tucked it away in the place behind her sternum where she was keeping all the things about Milton Hale, and she tried not to examine too closely why she was keeping them there. When the fiddle player switched to something slower and the dancing started, she was aware of him close beside her on the fence, and she was aware of the dancing, and she was aware that it would be a natural thing, a simple thing, to say something or to accept something, and she was also aware that she was not ready for it yet, and that he seemed to understand that because he did not say anything about the dancing, only sat beside her and watched with a companionable patience that cost him something, she thought, but that he offered anyway. On the drive home she sat alone in her wagon under a sky absolutely thick with stars, the way the sky gets in New Mexico at night when the air is clear, and she thought about the way he had sat beside her and not asked for more than she had to give, and she thought that Thomas would have liked him, which was a thought that arrived with both a pang and a kind of quiet peace. The Wednesdays continued. He always raised his hand from the road, and she always raised hers back, and sometimes she walked to the fence and they talked for 10 or 15 minutes, and sometimes, increasingly often, she was waiting at the fence before she heard the roan's hooves. She would not have admitted this to anyone. She might have admitted it to Cora, which was the same as admitting it to herself. In May there was a storm that came in fast from the northwest and blew shingles off her barn roof, and the following Wednesday he showed up with a bundle of new shingles on the back of his saddle and said, "I saw the roof from the road last week," and she said, "You see a great deal from that road," and he said, "I pay attention to things I care about," and then they both looked at the roof and neither of them said anything for a moment. He fixed the shingles. She held the ladder. She made coffee and he drank it sitting on her porch step with his long legs stretched out in front of him, and she sat in the chair behind him because if she sat on the step beside him something in her was going to do something she had not yet decided to do. "You knew Thomas," she said. It came out of the part of herself that needed to name things, to address them directly. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. "I knew of him," he said. "We met once at a cattle sale in 69 or 70. I was not yet 20 and he was already establishing himself." "What did you think of him?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I thought he was a man who did things right," he said. "I thought he knew what he had and knew the value of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I miss him," and it came out without armor, just plainly, the the way grief sometimes comes out when you are tired of carrying it very carefully. "Of course you do," Milton said, just as plainly, just as simply, without rushing to fill in anything around those words or to redirect her or to make himself more comfortable. She looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the late afternoon sun caught the edge of his face. "I think about whether it is right to—" She stopped. "To what?" he said quietly. She shook her head slightly. "To be glad of someone's company," she said finally, "when you are a widow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think Thomas Quinn would have wanted you to be glad of things." She looked out at her land, at the long horizontal line of the mesa going orange in the afternoon light. "I think so too," she said. He finished his coffee and he put the cup down and he stood and put his hat on and she walked with him to his horse and he mounted up. Before he touched the reins he looked down at her and he said, "Rebecca." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it came out of his mouth like something he had been carrying carefully for a while and had finally set down. "I would like to call on you properly if you would have it." She looked up at him. The evening was coming on, soft and lavender blue over the mesa, and there were fireflies, which did not always come this far west but had come tonight, small lights in the dusk along the dry creek bed. She thought about 14 months of being alone and how she had been fine with it, genuinely fine. And she thought about how these past weeks had made her aware of a quality of fineness that she had not quite been letting herself feel, a kind of warmth that had come back into the edges of her days like water slowly filling back into a dry creek after a rain. "I would have it," she said. He smiled then, a full smile, the first real full smile she had seen on him, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and lighter and something close to happy. "Sunday then," he said, "if the weather holds." "Sunday," she agreed. He rode out in the dusk and the fireflies moved along the creek and she stood in her yard for a long time after he was gone, looking at nothing in particular, with something that felt a great deal like hope moving quietly through her chest. He came Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. He always brought something small, never extravagant, because she would not have liked extravagance, and he seemed to understand that instinctively. Once he brought a book, the Twain she had mentioned, because she had admitted she had never read it. Once he brought a cutting of a hardy desert rose that Clara Delaney had said grew well in this soil. Once he brought nothing but himself, and that, she found, was the most welcome bringing of all. They walked her land in the evenings, and she showed him every part of it with the particular pride of someone showing another person something they love. The dry creek bed with its smooth, worn stones. The east pasture where the grass came up better than anywhere else because of some quality of the soil she had never been able to fully explain. The spot behind the barn where Thomas had planted a small apple tree that had, against all reasonable expectation, survived 3 dry summers and was now, in May, covered in small white blossoms. "Thomas planted this," she said, touching one of the blossoms. "How long has it been blossoming?" Milton asked. "This is the first year," she said. He was quiet, looking at the tree. Then he would be glad to see it. "I believe he would," she said. They sat on her porch after that and talked until the stars came fully out, and Milton stayed until it was almost improper, and then departed with his hat in his hand, and something in his expression that she knew the name of, and was beginning to be no longer frightened by. June arrived with heat that came down on the land like a judgment, the dry, relentless heat of a New Mexico summer that turns everything the color of old bone and makes the air shimmer in the mid-afternoon, so that distant things look like they are floating. Rebecca had lived with this heat her whole life, and she worked around it, starting early and finishing the hardest work by noon, taking the worst of the afternoon inside where it was marginally cooler. Milton came every Sunday without fail, and he had begun to help her with the larger tasks, the things that genuinely required 2 sets of hands, loading the heavy feed sacks, shifting the water barrels, checking the roof after a rare but violent afternoon storm that had rattled through one Thursday and left the whole land smelling of dust and petrichor. He never arrived expecting to work and never left without having helped, and he was careful about it. The way a person is careful when they understand that the help is about being together and not about any implicit suggestion that the person they are helping cannot manage alone. There was a man named Cole Draper who made things complicated in June. Cole Draper was a neighbor of sorts, owning a small grazing operation 4 miles to the north that he ran badly and resentfully, and he had, in the months after Thomas died, made several attempts to purchase the Quinn land at prices that were insults dressed up as offers. Rebecca had refused him every time with a directness that he had apparently interpreted as negotiation, because he kept returning. He arrived on a Monday in the second week of June, riding up to her yard with his hat pushed back and an expression of studied confidence on his face, and he told her he was prepared to make her a final offer, a generous offer, and that it was time she admitted she was not able to manage the place alone and took the reasonable course. Rebecca stood in her yard with her arms crossed and looked at Cole Draper with the expression she reserved for things that did not warrant a great deal of her energy but needed addressing clearly. "Mr. Draper," she said, "my answer is no, as it has been every other time. This land is mine and I intend to keep it, and I would appreciate it if you would stop coming here." Draper's confident expression turned ugly in the way that small men's expressions do when they encounter something they cannot move. "You are a woman alone," he said, "and this territory is not an easy place for a woman alone." "No," she agreed, "it is not. But it is my place and I manage it, and your opinion on the matter is not something I asked for or require." She let a significant pause go by. "Good day, Mr. Draper." She went back into her house and did not come out again until she heard him ride away, and then she stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table, taking a breath, because she would not let him see that her heart was going fast, but she could feel it going fast, and she hated that it was, hated the particular fear that came with being a woman alone and having a man stand in your yard and say things that were not quite threats but were meant to feel like them. She told Milton about it the following Sunday, because she had decided that she was not going to keep that kind of thing quietly inside herself when she had a person she could tell. Milton listened with a stillness that was not the stillness of a man about to do something rash, but the stillness of a man who was taking in information very carefully and deciding what was the right response to it. "He has done this before," he said. "It was not a question." "3 times," she said. "This was the 4th. "Do you want me to speak to him?" he said, and his voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness. "No," she said. "I do not want that. I do not want you involved in it on my behalf. Rebecca, I handled it," she said. "I am telling you because I wanted to tell you, not because I need it handled." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she could see him working through it, working through the instinct against the understanding, and she respected him enormously in that moment because he managed it, because he said, "All right," and meant it, not as a capitulation but as a genuine acknowledgement. "But you will tell me if it goes further." "I will tell you," she said. Draper did not come back. Whether it was her directness or whether word had gotten around that she was no longer entirely alone in the way that she had been, she could not say. She suspected the latter and felt complicated about it, and then she decided the complication was not worth her time and let it go. The heat of July was when she first let him hold her hand. It was a Sunday evening, and they were sitting on the porch as they had come to do reliably, and the last of the sun had gone, and the air had cooled to something bearable, and he had shifted beside her and his hand had come to rest near hers on the porch board between them, and she had looked at his hand, and she had thought about Thomas and about grief, and about the way the apple tree had bloomed this spring for the first time, and she had turned her hand over and he had folded his around it. And neither of them said anything for a long while. "Milton," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I am not the same person I was before Thomas died," she said. "I want you to know that. I do not know if I ever will be." "I know you now," he said. "I am not concerned with who you were before." She looked at their joined hands on the porch board. His was larger than hers, rougher, but he was holding it with a gentleness that said he understood this was something she was choosing to give and that he did not take that lightly. "I am starting to love you," she said, and she said it the way she said most difficult true things, directly and without decoration, and her voice was level even though she felt far from level inside. He was quiet for a moment that felt very long, and then he turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and his gray eyes in the dusk were very clear and very steady. "I am already there," he said. "I have been for a while." She looked at him. "How long?" "Since the morning I rode up and found you with an axe in your hands and half the tree already cleared," he said, and his voice was soft with something real in it, not romantic performance but genuine quiet admission. "I thought, there is a woman I want to know the rest of my life." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, unguarded, and she heard him exhale as though the sound of her laughing had relieved something in him. "That is not a romantic story," she said. "It is the truest one I have," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder just slightly, just a small weight, and he was still and solid beside her, and they sat like that while the stars came out and the coyotes called far away and the desert night went cool and sweet around them. In August, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it grandly. She would have been suspicious of a grand gesture from a man like Milton Hale, because a grand gesture would have meant he was performing rather than meaning it, and she had never once seen him perform anything. He did it simply, on a Saturday afternoon when they were both dusty from working, and she was washing her hands at the pump, and he was standing nearby with that deliberate quality he got when he was about to say something important, and he said, "Rebecca, I would like to marry you." She turned off the pump and dried her hands on her apron and turned around and looked at him, this man who had ridden up late one April morning and apologized for it, who had fixed her roof shingles and sat on her porch step and held her hand in the dark, who had never once looked at her land and thought of it as something other than hers, who read Emerson in a bunkhouse and wrote to his brother twice a year and swung an axe with perfect form. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He crossed the space between them and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and he said, "I will be a good husband to you." "I know you will," she said. "And I will be a good wife to you." He bent and kissed her then, her first kiss in 14 months, and it was nothing like she had feared it would be, not sad or weighted with comparison or complicated by guilt, but simply present, simply warm, simply itself. And she put her hand against his face and felt the rough of his jaw under her palm, and something that had been clenched tight for a very long time came quietly, completely, undone. They were married in September, in the same church where the social had been held, on a Saturday morning when the weather had turned cool and clear, and the sky over the mesa was the deep pure blue that only comes in fall in New Mexico. Cora Pembroke attended in her best dress and cried in a way that she was absolutely certain nobody noticed, which meant everyone noticed. The Delaney family took up a full pew, and Clara Delaney had made a cake of a magnificence that Rebecca had tried to discourage, and Clara had cheerfully ignored. A handful of other people from the county attended, people who had known Rebecca and Thomas, and who came with genuine warmth and a certain uncomplicated happiness about the whole thing. Rebecca wore a dress that was not white because she had not had a white dress to hand, and had not thought it appropriate to acquire one for a second wedding, but was instead a pale cream wool that Clara Delaney's eldest daughter had helped her make, and it was simple and perfectly fitted and exactly right, and she carried a small bunch of the hardy desert roses from the cutting Milton had brought her in May, which had taken and were growing along her porch by September, small and red and stubbornly alive. Milton stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him well and looked at her coming down the aisle with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt herself smile before she even reached him, a full smile, the kind she was giving more easily now. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony in a practical and warm manner, without excess ornamentation, which suited both of them. When he said the words that needed saying, and they said the words that needed saying back, and Milton put a plain gold band on her finger with both his hands steady and sure. She felt something settle in her, not the ending of something but the beginning, a new arrangement of things that made room for who she was now, for who she had been, for who she intended to be. They went back to her ranch, which was now their ranch, though she did not stop thinking of it as hers, and Milton did not expect her to, because he understood that the land was part of who she was in a way that predated him and would continue after many things, and that loving her meant loving what she was and what she held, not asking her to lay it down for the convenience of a pronoun. He had moved in officially the week before the wedding, bringing his small collection of books and his saddle and his tools and a photograph of his family from Texas, taken by a traveling photographer sometime in the 1860s, slightly blurry and very serious looking, the way photographs of that era always were. She found a place for the photograph on the mantel, and he had looked at her doing it, and something in his face had been very still and very full. The first winter they were married was a good winter, meaning it was hard in the way winters in New Mexico are hard, cold nights and wind that scoured the land and the constant vigilance required to keep livestock alive. But it was good because they faced it together, and because being together gave a quality to even the difficult things that made them different from when they had been faced alone. She had not realized entirely until she had the comparison how different it was to face hard things with someone beside you who genuinely intended to stay. He was a good partner, as good as she had hoped and in ways she had not quite anticipated. He did not take over. He did not assume. He consulted her on every decision about the land and the livestock, and the finances with a respect that went beyond mere courtesy, that was rooted in a genuine belief that her knowledge and judgment were as sound as his, and that two heads thinking about their land together was better than one. They disagreed sometimes, in the way two capable and opinionated people disagree when they are both thinking hard about the same problem. And they worked through the disagreements with the same practicality they brought to everything else, hearing each other out and finding the answer that was better than either of them had started with. At night they sat together by the stove while the wind came down off the mesa and the horses shifted and blew in the barn, and he read to her sometimes, which she had discovered she liked enormously, his low voice carrying Twain's words through the warm room, and sometimes she read to him, and sometimes neither of them read and they talked instead about the day and the land and the things they thought about. And sometimes they were simply quiet together in the way that is only possible with someone you trust completely. She had a life again. Not the same life as before, not a replacement or a restoration, but something genuinely its own, built out of who she was now and who he was and what they were making together. And it was a good life, a real life, one she had made with her own hands and her own choosing, same as she made everything. In March, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with it for a few days before she told him, because she needed to sit with it, to let herself feel everything she felt about it, which was more complicated and more layered than simple happiness, which included a grief that surprised her, a grief for Thomas who had wanted children and who was not here, and a happiness that was genuine and uncomplicated underneath the grief, and something else that she thought might be a particular kind of rightness. The feeling of a life going in a direction that was real and grounded and true. When she told Milton, they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, and he had gone very still in the way he went still when something important was happening, and then he had looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face, something enormous and quietly radiant. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it without saying anything for a moment. "Are you well?" he said finally. "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I feel good actually. I feel surprised." "I am not surprised," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I am surprised by the timing," he said. "I am not surprised that the world would give us this." She looked at him. "That is a very certain thing to say." "I am a certain person about certain things," he said, and he was smiling, the full smile that she loved, the one that changed his whole face, and she felt the happiness come up clean and full and without complication, just present, just real. She told Cora on the next visit, and Cora cried again with equal certainty about nobody noticing. The pregnancy was not easy in the ways that pregnancies are not easy, with a fierce morning sickness through April that she bore with her characteristic grimness of purpose, and a tiredness that was unlike her usual tiredness, heavier and more insistent, requiring her to actually rest in the afternoons, which she found nearly impossible to do, and which Milton enforced with a gentleness and humor that made her argue and comply in roughly equal measure. "I do not need to rest," she would say, and he would say, "The doctor said rest," and she would say, "I have been resting," and he would say, "Sitting upright in a chair mending harness is not what the doctor meant," and she would say a number of things after that, but eventually she would lie down and she would sleep, and she would wake up feeling better, which she found deeply annoying and was grateful for in equal measure. He took on more of the physical work without comment, without making a point of it, because he knew she would accept it more easily if he just did it than if he made a gesture of doing it. He rose before her in the mornings and had the stove going and the coffee on and the horses seen too, and she came out to find things already in motion, and she appreciated it with the particular appreciation of a person who has done everything alone and knows precisely what each thing costs. Summer came in with heat and the pregnancy with it, and she was enormous and uncomfortable and cheerfully herself throughout, working in the mornings and resting in the afternoons, and telling anyone who suggested she should slow down that she had been moving at this pace for 10 years, and she was not going to stop because of heat. She drew the line at the heavier lifting, which was a genuine concession, and one she made without as much resentment as she might have expected, because she was learning, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, that accepting help when it was reasonable to accept help was not the same thing as needing to be saved. The baby came on a Thursday morning in October, with the air turning cold and clean outside, and a midwife named Beatrice Soto present, a compact and authoritative woman from the town who had delivered approximately half the children in the county, and who directed everything with the calm efficiency of long experience. Rebecca labored through it with the same grimness and determination with which she did everything difficult, which is to say, she did not enjoy a moment of it, and she did not surrender a moment of it either, and she worked through it on her own terms. And when it was over and Beatrice put the baby in her arms, she looked down at a red and furious and absolutely perfect small face, and felt something come apart in her chest in the best possible way, a giving way. A flood of something so large it had no name she knew. Milton was in the room because she had insisted on it and because he would not have been anywhere else, and she heard him make a sound that she had never heard from him before, a single caught breath that was everything he had felt for the last 9 months and could not say compressed into one involuntary sound. "A boy," Beatrice said. Rebecca looked up at Milton, who was standing at the side of the bed with his eyes bright and his whole composed, controlled face absolutely undone. She held the baby out toward him, and he took the child with hands that were careful and wondering, the same hands that swung an axe and mended fence and turned pages by lamplight, now holding his son as though the child were made of something more precious than anything he had ever held. "What will you call him?" Beatrice asked. Rebecca and Milton had talked about names. They had talked about a great many names. She had been certain through most of the pregnancy that if it was a boy she would like to call him Thomas, and she had told Milton this, and Milton had said yes without hesitation, and then she had found in the last weeks that she was uncertain, that something in her wanted this child to have his own name entirely, not a memorial but a beginning. "James," she said. She had not told Milton she had changed her thinking. She looked at him as she said it. He looked from the baby to her, and his eyes were very bright. "James," he said, and his voice was rough with everything it was carrying. "James Thomas Hale," she said, "if you are willing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it over the baby's indignant sounds, and she knew he understood exactly what she had done, the giving of that middle name, and that he was grateful not for himself but for who she was, for the size of her heart, for all of it. James Thomas Hale was a good baby, by which Rebecca meant he was loud and demanding and entirely certain of his own importance, which she approved of enormously. He had her coloring, the dark brown hair that she had, and Milton's gray eyes, which delighted her in a way she had not anticipated, seeing that gray steadiness in a small new face every morning. He grew quickly and loudly through that first winter, filling the house with sounds it had never had before and requiring a thoroughgoing reorganization of every routine, which Rebecca approached with the same systematic efficiency. She approached everything and Milton with the same patient, flexible good humor that she was beginning to understand was one of the foundational qualities of the man. He was a wonderful father. She watched him with James, and she thought about fathers and what it meant, and how it was not a thing you could predict entirely from how a person was before they became one. Milton with James was the same as Milton with everything, fully attentive, unhurried, genuinely interested, responding to the child as a person whose experience of the world was real and worthy of engagement even before the child could articulate it. He talked to James the way he talked to her, directly and honestly, which seemed very early to be exactly correct, because James, by the time he could grip a finger, already had an expression when Milton spoke to him that looked remarkably like listening. The years built themselves out of the seasons, and the work and the daily accumulation of ordinary things that are, in total, the shape of a life. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not in the way of people who are expanding for expansion's sake, but deliberately, because Rebecca had always known what the land could sustain, and she knew when it had room for more and when it did not. They added cattle in the second year and a second barn in the third year, and an additional pasture when the Delaney family's neighboring section came up for sale, and the price was right. Milton's standing in the county grew alongside the ranches, because people who dealt with him over the years found consistently that he was what he appeared to be, which was increasingly rare and therefore more valuable than it might have been elsewhere. He left the Delaney employ at the end of the second year, not on bad terms, but because the ranch needed him full-time, and because he had come to think of the Quinn land, which was also his land now, as the place he had been looking for when he was a young man driving cattle north and not yet knowing what exactly he was heading toward. Jim Delaney shook his hand at the parting and told him he was the finest foreman he had ever had, and that the door was always open, and Milton thanked him with the same quiet simplicity with which he received every good thing. There was a drought in the spring of 1882 that took several of the small operations in the county under, because drought was the particular cruelty that the territory specialized in, and because having less margin meant having less resilience. Rebecca and Milton came through it because they had prepared, because they had been careful with the water from the beginning, and had drilled a second well in the fall of the previous year when the signs had begun to suggest a dry spring, because they had been watching the water, as she had always watched the water, and because two people thinking about the same problem from the same foundation of understanding were harder to catch unaware than one. Cole Draper's operation did not come through the drought. He sold what he had left in the summer of 1882 to a larger outfit from Colorado and left the territory, and Rebecca watched his dust disappear on the road north and felt nothing in particular except a mild relief that the question was settled. Cora Pembroke's health improved in a way that surprised the doctor and no one who knew Cora. By the summer of 1881 she was out of bed and back to being generally difficult about everything, which was her natural state, and she came to dinner at the ranch regularly and held James on her lap with an expression of complete softness that she would have denied with great vigor if anyone had commented on it. She and Milton got along on the basis of a mutual respect that expressed itself mostly as arguing cheerfully about practical things, and she told Rebecca privately that she approved of him enormously, which from Cora Pembroke was the equivalent of a full orchestra and a standing ovation. In the late spring of 1883, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she told Milton immediately, sitting across the kitchen table from him after supper in the lamplight with James asleep in the next room, and Milton smiled his full smile and said, "I am glad." And she said, "I am too," and they reached across the table for each other's hands in the gesture that had become so habitual it was as much a part of their daily life as the coffee and the morning chores. This pregnancy was different in the way that second pregnancies are different, which is to say she knew what to expect, and that made it both better and worse. Better because she was not surprised by anything, and worse because she remembered vividly everything there was to be surprised about. She was tired in a way that James was not entirely helpful with, because James at 2.5 was a person of great energy and definite opinions who required constant engagement, and she managed him and the land and the tiredness with her usual refusal to be defeated by anything. And Milton kept the coffee coming and took James with him on the morning rounds, so she could have an extra hour. And Cora came once a week and occupied James with stories so ferocious and so entertaining that he sat transfixed, which everyone agreed was nearly miraculous. The second child was born in December of 1883, another boy, arriving with the same urgency and certainty as his brother, and looking from his first moment as though he had important business to get on with. They called him William Hale, named for no one in particular, just named for himself, which seemed the right approach. William was, from the beginning, the opposite of his brother in every surface way, quiet where James had been loud, watchful where James had been active, taking everything in with a stillness that sometimes, when she caught it from certain angles, made her breath catch because it reminded her so completely of his father. He had her brown hair and James's dark eyes, and he was contented and self-sufficient in ways that James had never been and still was not, which meant that caring for him was different than caring for James had been, not easier, just differently demanding. James, at 3, took his brother's arrival with the fierce curiosity of a person encountering something genuinely new in his world. He examined the baby with an intensity that Beatrice Soto said she had never seen in a sibling introduction, and then he announced, with the authority of a small person who has thought something through, "He is very small." "He is," Milton agreed. "I will teach him things when he is bigger," James said. "That would be generous of you," Rebecca said, hiding her smile. "I know a great many things," James said, which was not untrue. The years continued. James learned to ride at 4 and to read at 5 and to argue with extraordinary skill at every age, which Rebecca considered both a challenge and a sign of intelligence. William walked late but talked early, and once he started talking, he talked with a quiet and specific precision that suggested he had been saving things up for some time and was now prepared to deploy them. By the time he was 3, he was following Milton around the ranch with a focus that was not play but something more like apprenticeship, watching how his father's hands moved on tools and fence wire and reins with an attention that was already, clearly, building towards something. Rebecca was 36 in the spring of 1886, which was a year when a great many things happened in the New Mexico Territory, because the Apache conflicts that had been ongoing through much of the previous years were finally coming to a resolution of sorts, and the railroad was changing what the territory felt like, connecting it to the rest of the country in ways that were bringing people and goods, and also changing things in ways that were not all good. Displacing people who had been on the land for centuries, complicating a world that was already complicated, and she had feelings about all of it that she discussed with Milton in the long evenings when the children were asleep, and the world was quiet enough to think. She had always been aware of the injustices around her in a way that made her uncomfortable with comfortable silence about them. The Pueblo people whose land had been appropriated, the Apache whose resistance was being crushed and condemned, even as the reasons for it were plain enough if you were willing to look at them honestly. The Mexican families who had been on this land before any American settler, and who were now treated as lesser in their own home. She talked about these things and she acted on what she could act on, which was not enough but was what she had. And Milton listened and thought and talked with her about it without pretending the complexity was simple, which she valued. He had his own thinking on it, shaped by his years on the trail and what he had seen of the way the West was going, and who it was going there at the expense of. They did not always arrive at exactly the same place, but they arrived at places near enough each other that the conversation was always worth having. And she thought that this too was a kind of love, the willingness to think hard together about difficult things and not demand that the other person's thinking be identical to your own. That spring, in April of 1886, 8 years to the month after the cottonwood tree had fallen across the road, and Milton Hale had ridden up late to help with it, Rebecca was standing at the east fence in the early morning, looking out over the pasture where the grass was coming up better than it had in years, the winter rains having been generous, and the land responding with the particular gratitude that dry land shows when it gets what it needs. She heard the gate and turned, and Milton was coming across the yard toward her with 2 cups of coffee, James and William trailing behind him in various states of preparedness for the day, James already fully dressed and purposeful, William still adjusting his suspenders. Milton handed her a cup and stood beside her looking out at the pasture. "The grass is good this year," he said. "The best in years," she said. They stood together for a moment, drinking their coffee in the morning quiet, the children eventually drifting to look at something near the barn that had caught their interest, and the sun coming up over the mesa in the particular way it came up in New Mexico in April, like something being revealed, like a curtain going back. 8 years, she said. He turned to look at her. "Since the tree," she said. "It was April." He thought about it. "It was the 6th, he said, "of April." She looked at him. "You know the exact date." "I know the exact date," he said. She looked back at the mesa and the morning light on it. 8 years of this man beside her, 8 years of mornings like this one, of hard work and good work and the particular satisfaction of a life built right, of children and books and lamplight and her land going on in all directions, and this man whose steady gray eyes she had looked up into from the road that morning when he had said he was sorry he was late, this man who had meant it, who had been heading somewhere even when he did not know it, who had found her and stayed. "I was thinking about the night the tree came down," she said. "I heard it fall. It was the middle of the night and it woke me up and I lay there in the dark listening to the quiet afterward and I thought, I will have to deal with that in the morning." "And you did," he said. "I was more than halfway done when you arrived," she said. "You were," he said, and there was no diminishment in it, only a pride in her that she had come to trust completely. "I did not think that morning," she said slowly, "that the tree falling would lead to anything but getting the road clear and getting to Cora. I did not think about anything beyond the task." "No," he said. "And then you rode up," she said. He was quiet beside her for a moment. "Then I thought about that ride every day for weeks afterward. I thought about how I should have left earlier. I thought about whether you would still be there when I got there or whether you would have gone a different way, whether we would not have met at all. I thought about how close it was." She looked at him. "It was not that close," she said. "You would have come on the Wednesday and I would have been at the fence and you would have raised your hand." "I know," he said, "but that first morning mattered." "It did," she admitted. He took her empty coffee cup and set both of them on the fence post and turned to face her fully, and he took her face in both his hands the way he sometimes did when he was saying something he wanted her to hear clearly, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes that she had been looking into for 8 years, and that still, had the capacity to make her feel something that was bigger and warmer than any word she had found for it. "I will be sorry every year that I was late that morning," he said. "And I will be grateful every year that it did not matter, because you were already there, and you were already handling it, and you were exactly who you are." She put her hand over one of his. "You were not that late," she said. He smiled, full smile. the one that had undone her the first time she had seen it and that had never once stopped doing it. "Rebecca," he said. "Milton," she said back. He kissed her in the morning light, with the sound of James explaining something to William in the background and the roan's successor, a gray horse named for nothing in particular, moving in the pasture behind them and the mesa going gold with the rising sun, and the coffee cups balanced on the fence post, and the apple tree behind the barn somewhere, covered this spring as every spring with small white flowers, blooming because it had survived, blooming because the land was good, blooming because things that hold on long enough and are tended right will eventually find their season. They pulled apart and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they looked out at their land together, at the grass coming up good in the east pasture, at the horses moving in the early light, at their boys by the barn, at the road running straight and clear in both directions with nothing blocking it now and nothing in sight that they could not handle between them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad the cottonwood fell," she said. He made a sound that was half a laugh, warm and low, and she felt it through his chest against her shoulder. "So am I," he said. She smiled and drank the last of the morning and stood in the April light on her land, on their land, with the man she loved beside her and her sons calling to each other near the barn, and everything she had built and chosen and held onto solid under her feet. And she thought that this was it, this particular ordinary extraordinary morning. This was what life was. This was what she had dragged the tree off the road and sharpened the axe and got up every morning for. This was it. Right here, this. James came running across the yard toward them with the news that there was a hawk's nest in the big pine by the water trough, and William came after him at his own more considered pace, and Milton let her go to crouch down with the boys and talk about the nest. And she stood at the fence a moment longer watching the three of them with an expression she could feel on her own face, full and unguarded and entirely without shame. The expression of a woman who has not merely survived the things that tried to take her down, but has built something magnificent from the material she was left with. Then she went to join her family. The nest had 4 eggs in it, small and blue-green and perfectly formed, and James was already certain he could build a ladder to see them better, and William was asking careful questions about how long before they would hatch, and Milton was answering him with the patient thoroughness she had always loved in him, and Rebecca knelt in the warm April dust next to her youngest, and looked at those small perfect eggs in their nest, and felt the rightness of things settle through her like water going into dry ground. "Can we watch them hatch?" William asked. "If we are patient," Milton said, "and if we do not disturb them." "I can be patient," William said seriously. "I know you can," Milton said, and he looked across the boys' heads at Rebecca and his eyes said everything, said all of it, said the 8 years and the tree and the road and the coffee on the fence post, and the apple tree and James, Thomas and William, and the gray horse and the evenings by the stove and every Wednesday on the road and the first morning and all the mornings after. Said all of it in one clear gray steady look, and she looked back and said it all back to him without a word. The hawk's eggs hatched 11 days later on a Thursday morning, 4 small, fierce, perfect things coming into the world exactly as they should, exactly on time,